Pixelkin.
When most people hear the word needlepoint, they probably don't think about video games. Well, they should. The two go together fantastically. One of the most common types of needlepoint is cross-stitch, which involves sewing lots of tiny X's to create a big image. Here's what a cross-stitch looks like. See how it's kind of blocky? Every stitch is part of a big grid, just like old video game artwork. You see, old games didn't have the technology to create thousands of pixels per inch. They had to use every pixel wisely. This style of animation is called 8-bit, and a lot of new games use it too to evoke a nostalgic feel. Because 8-bit and cross-stitch both use grids to create a picture, it turns out that 8-bit artwork makes for an almost perfect cross-stitch pattern. And that's why we're here, so you can turn your favorite video game characters into cool cross-stitches. First step, let's choose a character.
If you've never made a cross-stitch before, you're going to want to start simple. The fewer pixels in your character, the easier they will be to cross-stitch. You also should pay attention to how many colors are being used. The fewer colors, the fewer supplies you'll have to buy. After you've gotten comfortable with these small patterns, you can step up the difficulty and try some more advanced stuff. For now though, let's keep it simple.
Step 2. Make your pattern.
Now that you've picked a character, it's time to print it out. Go ahead and fill up the whole page. In order to make stitching and counting easy later on, you'll want to draw a grid onto whichever image you choose to stitch. With a ruler and a pencil, draw lines across your picture that match up with the edges of the square pixels. After you have a grid, add numbers across the top and down the side. That way, you know how much fabric you'll be taking up before you start. It will also help you keep track of your stitches later on. If you'd rather do this step on your computer, that works too.
Now that you know what colors you'll need for your character, we can go ahead to step 3, buying materials.
To complete your cross-stitch, you'll need a few things. Luckily, they tend to be very affordable. 1. Embroidery needle. Most sewing needles will work, but if the eye is too small, you might have trouble getting the thick embroidery floss to fit through. A pack of embroidery needles will usually cost you less than $5. 2. Embroidery floss. This special kind of thread is extra thick to give your embroidery a nice, bold finish. Floss usually costs about 25 cents per skein, and you will not be using an entire skein. 3. Cross-stitch fabric. Technically speaking, any kind of fabric will do, but cross-stitch fabric is nice and stiff and is covered in little holes which are perfect for creating your 8-bit masterpiece. If you're going to stitch a character that is white, like Gomez from the game Fez, you might want to find some fabric that is a color other than white, so that your character is visible. 4. A pair of scissors. Gotta snip that floss.
Step 4. Making your first stitch.
Let's start by pulling out some floss. You'll want about an arm's length per color. The embroidery floss will be a bit too thick for our needs, but luckily we can make it thinner. Tease the ends of the floss and notice that it's actually made of 6 strands of thread. Take 3 strands in one hand and 3 in the other and slowly pull them apart until you have 2 equally thick clumps of floss. If you go too quickly, they'll bunch up and knot. Move slowly and it's a piece of cake. Take either half and thread it through your needle. Once it's in, pull it a few inches through to help prevent it from falling out. One of the great things about cross-stitch is that there's no need to tie a knot at the end of your thread. More on that in a minute. Let's set up the fabric. Don't cut into it just yet. Instead, you should pick a corner and stitch inward from there. That way, if your pattern is a little bigger than expected, you won't run out of room. Don't start too close to the edge though. This kind of fabric unravels easily, so you'll want a nice safety buffer for your artwork. Before we begin, let's take a look at this chart. Cross-stitching is all about making little X's. We'll be starting in the top left corner of the X and then moving to the bottom right corner. For your first stitch, you'll want to push the needle up from the bottom of the fabric. Pull the thread almost all of the way through. Then, bring the needle down through a hole that's diagonal from your starting point. Pull the thread tight, but not too tight. You want that little thread tail to stay where you left it. Now push the needle back up from the bottom. As you do this, you can secure the loose dangling thread from before underneath your new stitch. I'm using bigger stitches than usual so you can see what I'm doing. Oh hey, you have a pattern! Pay attention to which part of the X is on top. Ideally, every stitch in your pattern will match.
Step 5. Following along with your pattern.
Now that you've mastered the single stitch, it's time to do a whole bunch more. Keep your printed pattern on hand for reference. To save you from rethreading your needle every other stitch, you're going to want to embroider one color at a time. For my Kirby pattern, I started with black. Try to move in a logical order, doing stitches next to each other as often as possible. Avoid jumping around on the pattern. This will help you prevent knotting on the backside. When it's time to move on to a new floss, either because you've run out or because you've finished with your color, you're going to want to tuck your needle through the backs of a few stitches to secure the tail end of the floss. Snip off the excess and start on your new color in the same way, by threading your needle through the backs of other stitches.
Somewhere in here you're probably going to have to deal with some knots. it'll be okay. Let me give you a couple of tips. You just want to work through them slowly with your needle and try not to pull on them too much, because then they'll get really tight and hard to untie. Step 6, presentation. There's lots of different things you could do with your cross stitch now that it's done, but one of the easiest things to do is to put it in a frame. You could either take your finished cross stitch to a framing shop, now that you know exactly what size frame you'll need, or you could be super classy like me and go to Goodwill and get a picture frame for 50 cents to $1. Ta-da! You have created a gorgeous piece of artwork. Now that it's framed, you can hang it on your wall, you can give it to a friend, you could make it a subtle set piece in the background of your video programs. If you like your creation, email it to hello@pixelkin.org. I would love to take a look at it. If you liked this video, please subscribe to our channel. We have lots of other really cool videos about gaming and crafts and parenting and families and all kinds of cool stuff. And be sure to visit pixelkin.org.